You may be wondering why we're running the numbers here. Well, as of the last report in the last 30 seconds or so, global brainiac Howard Bloom is not answering his phone. Now, I know he's on for tonight because he had even emailed me some thoughts to consider before he came on. And so I know he knows, and I know that we know that he knows. We're just not sure that somehow the forces of the universe are going to allow this to happen. And I say that because it's almost like I've been in a technical jinx all weekend long. I don't know what it is. You heard last night we had some problems, and it's so far been glitch-free this evening until now. So maybe there is some other concern with Howard, but I'm hoping that it's because something on his end isn't right, and he's just hearing us now say that we don't have him and we've been trying to get him, and so he'll call us. Cross your fingers. Either way, we'll get to open lines if Howard Bloom's not available, but I think he will be. Let's just all, I tell you what, let's just go ahead and let's manifest Howard Bloom. It's just all together, just go Bloom, 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 and hope that he shows up next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. I think Howard's here. Evening, Howard Bloom. Howard. Try again. Howard. Bloom, 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 Bloom. Try again. Howard. It's just been one of those weekends. I'll try it again. Everybody together. Bloom. We're going to manifest Howard Bloom here. Bloom, 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 Bloom. Howard?
Yes.
There he is. Okay. You see, you keep the faith.
Right.
It may not come, the miracle may not come on our timetable, but, we learn. Howard, how are you this evening?
Absolutely terrific, Ian. How are you?
Good. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And, of course, Howard's two most famous works, other than his very ingenious behind-the-scenes work in the music and entertainment industry, the two big books, The Lucifer Principle and The Global Brain. Been thinking about you. It occurred to me that we almost seem to always talk somewhere right around Halloween.
Right. Aha.
I don't know why that is.
The world is changing as if it is a giant mask and a jack-o'-lantern in front of our eyes, thanks to the credit collapse.
Maybe that's right. So thank you, everybody who had called in to be your backup. I think we had five. I think we had 5 people on hold. That's how many people it takes to replace a Howard Bloom if you hadn't been available. So, and so glad it worked out. Howard, let's just start at the beginning. What do you use as a criteria for an economic crisis? As you, during your research, as you went back in time, as you cracked the books over 400 years of history, how do you define economic crisis in your studies in order to learn from that and inform us about what we're going through today or what might happen in the next year or two?
Okay, there are the big ones and there are the small ones. The little ones come roughly every 10 years. They work in roughly 3-year cycles. So you go up for 3 years, and then you go down for 3 years, and if you do the arithmetic, it all muddles out to approximately once every 10 years. And that's been happening ever since 1637.
Okay.
We'll go back to 1637 in a minute. But the big ones, Ian, it's the difference between catching a wave and catching a tsunami.
Okay.
And the big ones are enormous. And the big ones come every 70 years. And every time it happens, the world is absolutely convinced that it has never seen anything like it before. And every single time, the world is wrong. And the 70-year cycles are tapped in to a giant techno cycle. And the techno cycle goes something like this. A new technology and a new energy source comes in. It bubbles under the surface for a long time. Then it begins to rise. Then it begins to skyrocket. The country that's on top of the new technology rules the world. It feels magnificent. And then the new technology peaks, and there comes a time when everybody's got the new technology, and they don't keep buying it like crazy anymore. And it's not on a massive growth curve. And that's where things begin to slow down, and the people who are on top of the world, because they own the new technology, begin to wonder what's happened, why things are not growing as fast anymore. And then the technology becomes old. And as it becomes old, the country that ruled the world begins to sag and sag further and sag further. But there's a new technology coming along, and it's bubbling just beneath the surface, and nobody quite sees it. Right. Usually the country that was on top of the world doesn't grab hold of it. And as it's bubbling under, there's a huge crash. There was something called the Great Depression. It happened in 1873, not 1930, not 1929, 1873, and it lasted 20 years.
Now, before we go there, let's go back to 1637. What significant event happened in 1637 that allowed you to mark that as sort of the beginning of your timeline for this discussion?
The 1637 was Holland was just beginning to take off in a major way as a center of global trade. Vasco da Gama in 1492 had managed to make it all the way around the southern tip of Africa and find a whole new route to India. India is where all the hot fabrics came from, the incredibly expensive fabrics that were the fabrics of kings. The Dutch in Antwerp and Amsterdam were importing them like crazy. And now that they were on top of a global importing culture, they began to import something else as a status symbol for the guys who were cleaning up, making a fortune off of this new global textiles business. And these new status symbols were, and you've heard of this, they were tulip bulbs. They came from Turkey, and they were a kind of flower that Europe had never seen before. And rich men tried to rich men, we're talking about merchants, a brand new thing called the middle class that had never existed before, at least not since the days of Rome.
Right.
These middle-class guys making a fortune off of selling things they were importing were able to buy tulip bulbs. And first they bought them for the price of a nugget of gold, and then they bought them for the price of a daughter, and then they bought them for the price of a house, and then they bought them for the price of an estate. And tulip bulbs kept rocketing upward in price. It seemed that didn't matter how expensive a tulip bulb was, because even if you had to spend the cost of a coach and 4 horses to get it, you knew it was going to double in the next 6 months. Sound like real estate?
Yeah, it does. Now, when you say tulip bulbs, you just mean one bulb, or when you say tulip bulbs, you mean like for a coach and 4 horses, you got 1,000 tulip bulbs?
That's one bulb.
One bulb.
One bulb. The story is told of the day that one of these merchants was in his store and a sailor walked in. And the merchant walked into his back room to see if he had what the sailor was coming in to get. Meanwhile, the sailor was hungry. The sailor pulled out his bread, sliced what looked like an onion on the table, stuck it in between his 2 slices of bread, and ate it. It bankrupted the merchant. That was the new tulip bulb he just spent everything he had on. What the other guy thought was what the sailor thought was an onion.
And he ate it.
He ate it.
And the guy goes broke because his one tulip bulb, his entire
right.
capital for the next quarter is gone.
Yes, right. You've got it.
All right. So
one tulip bulb.
So just much like the way that some people have seen Wall Street eat their lunch lately, this guy did that with it. So and the reason here that tulip bulbs were so big was just because it was the perception of their value.
It was said the magic word, Ian,
okay.
Perception. Yes, it was the perception of the value. And as long as people thought that tulip bulbs were going to keep on doubling every 6 months in value, tulip bulbs are incredibly valuable. And then people began to grow tired of their tulip bulbs. And they they went about as far in skyrocketing tulip bulbs as they could. And the tulip bulb mania began to coast, and then it began to decline. And then your tulip bulbs that you had bought for the equivalent of $136,000 or more were suddenly worth $36. And many a person went broke. And that's the first sign I could find of the cycle. But if you gave me a month of research, I'm sure I could find you cycles like this all the way back in the days of the Greek and Roman Empire, because the Greek and Roman Empire, remember, they were the equivalent of global empires in their own day, too.
You know, I was thinking a little bit about perceived value because of this great guest, great subject I think we did a couple of years ago with Tracy Twyman called Money as Magic. and it's all about the perceived value of a piece of, paper with cotton fibers in it, because if you just printed on it, this is worth $5 and put a picture of President Bush on it, nobody would pay $5 for it. Nobody would but we put all of these occult symbols on it, and we put, old dead white men on it, and we put all these other things on it that to us make it seem like it has value. Then we put our faith in that piece of paper with cotton fibers in it. And what's so intriguing about that is, just as you're talking about the tulip bulbs, I mean, imagine if there had been a tulip bulb rescue plan in 1637.
What a great idea.
I mean, what if the government had stepped in and said, oh, wait, we got to keep the value of tulip bulbs artificially inflated.
Right.
So what can we do to keep the economy, our tulip-based economy going?
Right. Well, you could have done that, because the big problem is, somebody asked me the other day, but when you have these giant crashes, don't you still have all the workers? And don't they still have all their skills? And aren't there still all the factories? Don't you have all the material for wealth? So why don't we have wealth? And it's because of perception. It's because of something very closely related to perception, emotion. Everything in an economy, we are accustomed to looking at it in terms of numbers, and we think those are dry and cold and impersonal, and they are. But the fact is, the word value is based on an emotion. I value something. I want it. And wanting is an emotion. Right. The word trust that you just used, that's an emotion. If I trust you, I feel confident in you. I feel confident that if I hand you $10 and you tell me you're going to hold on to it for 10 years and you're going to give it back to me as $20, and because I believe in you, belief, another emotion, everything is fine until somebody shatters my confidence, until somebody destroys my trust, until somebody sends me into a panic. And all of those words, trust, confidence, and panic, those are emotional words.
Well, and yet even looking at the tulip analogy back to 1637, tulips were not a finite resource per se.
Right.
I mean, you can always grow more of them. It's a little bit like diamonds, not a precious commodity, unless you control their mining and their distribution. Right. And then you can make it be, if you throw in the perception that you have to have a diamond, like you have to have tulips, then suddenly you can control a market, and you can inflate the price of something as you desire to, just by cutting back on the scarcity. But it's not precious. It never was precious. It's just you could create an artificial scarcity.
But remember, why do we find gold precious? Now, don't think of the usual answers for a second. Think of this. You can't eat gold.
Right.
You can't make a house out of gold. You can't make clothing out of gold. You could, with great difficulty, weave it into fabrics, but it's with great difficulty. It's of no practical value. What value, then, does it have that makes it of such intense emotional value? Well, for one thing, there's its scarcity. But there are other things that are scarce. How long has it been since you've bought an obsidian necklace or an obsidian bowl? That used to be the really high-touch, high-value stuff in the Stone Age.
Right.
But it's obviously nothing of intrinsic value because nobody bothers anymore. But we still bother with gold. Why? It's the magic. That's what your friend said. It's the perception. It's the emotion that we attach to gold.
So, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, so that we go back to 1637. It's a really interesting analogy about the great tulip crash of 1637 and people going bankrupt because it was all based on the idea that it doesn't matter how ridiculously high the price is, I'll double my money. I'm almost guaranteed of it, and then it doesn't happen. Relate that then to some of these other cycles that you speak of in history, the major ones, the 70-year ones.
Well, let's look at the one this time. Property values were going up. People were buying books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad were telling ordinary people the only difference between rich people and you is that rich people got involved in real estate. Because take $1 and invest it in real estate, and within 6 months it'll be worth $2. Flip that $1 or that $2 and put it back in real estate, and in another 6 months it'll be worth $4. Flip houses, buy houses and flip them. And that's what people began to do. Meanwhile, back in the days of the the Clinton administration, remember, I'm a registered Democrat, which sometimes makes me very unpopular because, I run this thing called the Space Development Steering Committee that Buzz Aldrin and Edgar Mitchell got me into, and all the boys there are Republicans, so I'm considered a wild radical. But I like Bill Clinton. But Bill Clinton established a policy that led to something called ninja loans. Do you know what those are?
No, but it doesn't sound good already. These stealth loans, they come in, nobody knows they're there.
What Bill Clinton wanted to do in the true spirit of democracy is give every man the right to own a house.
Right.
A chicken in every pot, a car in every garage, and a deed in every pocketbook. And ninja loans are no income, no asset loans. That means, you remember the old days, maybe 4 years ago, you used to go into a bank to get a mortgage, and it was like going through an application to get into heaven.
Right.
You had to fill out so much paperwork, it was ridiculous. You had to go through so many checks of your previous bank accounts and your previous wives and your previous lifetimes that it was mind-boggling. And finally, if you were really lucky and if you crawled all the way across the floor of the bank from the entrance door to the vault, pushing a penny with your nose, they would give you a mortgage.
Right, and then you were happy to get it at 11%.
You licked the knees of the bank officer who gave it to you.
Right, at 11%.
Yes.
I remember getting an 11% loan, and my wife saying, "You know how good that is."
Amazing. Well, at any rate, that's what you used to have to do. Now, in the last 4 years, what you've had to do, thanks to the legacy of the ninja loans of the Clinton administration, was you managed to find a mortgage broker, or a mortgage broker found you, and you were actually earning, let's say, $6.50 an hour flipping burgers at McDonald's. And when you sat down with the mortgage broker said, "How much did you say you make? $6.50 an hour?" And you said yes. And he said, "Let's make that $65,000 a year." And he wrote it down on your application. And then he said, "How much are you worth?" And you took out your pocketbook and you counted $40 and realized you had no money in the bank or anything else. And he said, $40. Okay, let's say that's $400,000. And he wrote it down on your application. And he filled out all the relevant paperwork to make it look like, in fact, you were making $65,000. Oh, by the way, I've seen these credit applications, and this is literally what they say. That you're making $65,000 a year and that you're worth $400,000. And he sends it in. And sure enough, you get the mortgage. What's more, you're delighted because you're buying a $35,000 house, and they've just given you a $45,000 mortgage. So you think you're walking away with extra money in your pocket.
Right.
And you are absolutely delighted. Now, of course, it's one of those flexible interest mortgages. So what you're paying this year is not the same as what you're going to be paying next year. The real pain and suffering is going to start sometime in the future. But who cares? You know that the house is going to be worth twice as much in only 6 months. You read it in Rich Dad, Poor Dad. How could a big book like that be wrong?
Well, and you also saw that, though, confirmed everywhere. Every news story was about the skyrocketing value, and look what people are doing and how you can buy a house on Monday and sell it again for a profit on Friday in the right economy. Well, hang on to that. From Howard Bloom's tulips to God's ears. We will continue this conversation. We're just starting back in 1637. Howard has been researching the history of economic crashes, the big ones and the small ones. And Howard is going to tell us coming up in the next half hour about the one we're into vis-a-vis, the Great Depression, the one he mentioned back in the 1800s. And then we'll talk about what have governments done historically in the past that have worked, what hasn't worked, and how this might push us ever so closer to World War III. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Talking about the crash from last week, I guess that's the only word we could really use for it. Unless we look at it in a historical context, Howard Bloom has a new book coming up. It's called The Rise of the Cup and Saucer, A Radical Reperception of Western Civilization, or, and like the book needs another subtitle, or Reinventing Capitalism, Putting Soul in the Machine. Back with Howard Bloom in just a moment. I was sticking my head out of my window here, and I was listening to the night wind, and I was smelling the air, and I thought to myself, there just seems to be a different quality, a different tonal feel to the night wind. And then I went back to the conversation we just had about perception. We perceive that because there are fewer cars out there. There are fewer people chattering away in the neighborhood, fewer dogs barking. And as a result, it changes our perception of the night wind. The wind itself doesn't change. It's not any different than it would be 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's especially here in the upper Midwest. Both breezes were cool today, but it's how we hear it. It's how we experience it. And that's just what's going on right now on Wall Street. Now, what about the other years that we've had major economic collapses? Well, Howard Bloom's been studying them, what we can learn from them, what it informs us about what we're going through now and the future, but through Howard Bloom's distinct lens next. On Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Howard Bloom, the author of this new book, The Cup and the Rise of the Cup and Saucery. I look forward to talking more about that because I have a feeling, knowing your other books, that you have true and challenging insights coming in this new book and how it will help us avoid our own personal economic collapses. But we'll get to that in just a minute. We were talking about the first crash of 1637 in your timeline, that being the great tulip bulb disaster of Holland, and how so many people had invested in tulip bulbs because they were used to seeing the price double so often. And then relating that now forward through history, there was another crash you started to talk about earlier, and that was the crash of was it 1887? Is that what you said?
Yeah, it was the Great Depression of 1873. And okay, this is a fascinating one. France ruled the world. Now, Ian, I wish I could tell you exactly what technologies and what goods France was on top of when it ruled the world, but the fact is, in roughly 1750 or so, there was what Winston Churchill called a world war going on, and it was going on between France and England. And England was not guaranteed top position in this. In fact, the reason in 1776 that we won our revolution wasn't because we were stronger than the British. It was because the British were tied down on so many different fronts around the world, including in India, where they were fighting for India with France. But they didn't have enough manpower to take care of us, and we were a minor nuisance, so they brushed us aside. We got our independence not because we fought so hard, but because they were so distracted. Now, in 1750, and right up until Napoleon's time in 1814, when he finally lost at the Battle of Waterloo, France was the biggie, and England was not. But England was about to come up on France's blind side because of the kind of economic factors we were talking about before. We talked about the fact that there are the small cycles, roughly every 10 years, and then there are the big cycles. There are the tides, and then those are the small ones, and then there are the tsunamis. And the tsunamis come once every 70 years, and they come because of a tech cycle. And here's how that tech cycle worked. Britain, which was an underdog, in 1750, invented something. Now remember, when the Dutch were cleaning up on the world market and able to afford to spend the price of an estate on a tulip bulb, it was because the Dutch were importing fabrics from India. Now, how many people do you imagine could afford those fabrics from India? Very, very few, because they sold for a fortune. They were miracle fabrics. The normal fabric, if you and I had been around back then, you and I would have been wearing the equivalent of felt clothing. And felt is made out of the same stuff wool is. It's made out of animal fiber, animal hair. And what happens, Ian, if you've got one suit of clothes, if that's all you can afford, because clothes are terribly expensive, and they're made of felt, they're very much like wool, and you decide to wash them, what's going to happen to your one suit of clothes?
It'll shrink.
That's right. It'll be fit for a 3-year-old.
Right.
So you can never launder your clothes. Now, aside from the fact that this might smell a little bit, meaning that the era that back in 1750 people smelled a little different than they do today, aside from that, it meant that you couldn't launder these things, and because you couldn't launder these things, there were tens of thousands of parasites who lived in that nice, loose weave of the felt, and they lived off of you, and they took an extra 20 years off of your life. Now, if you were a king, you could afford to buy this miracle fabric from India. And the miracle fabric breathed with your skin, and if you were able to afford 12 laundry ladies to work all the time, boiling it and pounding it on rocks, they could launder it. You could own a dozen suits of it, and you could change clothes every day, and it had a tight weave, and insects did not live in it very easily. So these clothes, these miracle fabrics from India, could add 20 years to your life and give you the opportunity to bathe on a fairly regular basis. Well, again, only kings could afford this stuff, and it was by selling this stuff, cotton from India, that the Dutch were getting rich enough to buy tulips for the price of an estate. All of a sudden, in 1750, somebody in England developed something interesting, a new piece of technology. It was called
Deodorant.
No, unfortunately, that wasn't going to come for a while.
Oh, okay. All right, sorry. I was trying to follow your line of logic. Okay, so not antiperspirant. They invented what then?
They invented the automatic weaving machine.
Oh, of course, right.
So that instead of one little guy sitting there or one little woman sitting in a cottage in India with her loom, you could have one person doing the equivalent of the work of 12 people at hand looms. Now, the British began to develop a homegrown cotton industry. Well, not homegrown. They also developed a monocropping, a monoculture business, which means raise only one crop, find absolutely the best land for it, absolutely the best temperature and weather for it, and then concentrate on it and continue and genetic engineer it like crazy. So you make it as productive as you can. That's monocropping. And the big farms on which you raised only one crop were called plantations. So between plantations on which they raised cotton and the automatic cotton weaving machine, cotton began to come down in price and began to become more readily available. And then in 1800, the British invented something else. They invented the steam engine. And guess what happens when you hooked a steam engine up to an automatic weaving machine?
Right.
You could weave cotton, this miracle, extraordinarily expensive fabric. You could weave it so inexpensively that middle-class people could afford it. And it set off something that I call, in Reinventing Capitalism, Putting Soul in the Machine, in the upcoming book, I call it the soap and cotton revolution. Because chemists at that point were brand new. Nobody had ever heard of chemistry before. It was this brand new thing. And chemists developed a way of making this new stuff, mass-producing this new stuff, which up until then people used primarily as a jewel or had swallowed as a medicine, called soap. And by 1832, the soap industry had managed to invent the advertising business, and it advertised itself so thoroughly that Karl Marx's mom said to him in about 1832 something to the effect of, you can tell a civilized people by the number of times it washes a day. Well, Ian, 50 years earlier, nobody had washed.
Right.
If you washed once a year, it was taking your life in your hands. You could come down with pneumonia.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
It was your force field.
Right. So we had the soap and cotton revolution. Now, look at Britain. Britain is behind France. France is much, much more powerful than Britain. But Britain is fighting with France anyway, and it invents this thing in 1750 that automatically weaves cotton. It makes it a top-secret technology. It will not allow anybody to leave England with a drawing or a notebook in any way describing this machinery. It's scared to death it's going to lose it. Then it hooks up the steam engine. Then it hooks the steam engine up to boats. And it hooks steam engines up to these little sort of trolleys on rails that used to be drawn by donkeys in order to get coal out of the ground. And it invents something new called the railroad. Okay, now Britain is on top of the new technology of its era. It is on top of pig iron, which is what you make steam engines out of. It's on top of steam engines. And it's on top of cotton. And Britain's economy begins to roar. Just after the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, there was a big depression in roughly 1814 and 1815. But then the new technology that's been bubbling under the surface for the last 60 years, all of this new technology we're talking about begins to rise. And as it rises, Britain rises. And Britain has a new queen, by the way, and her name is Victoria. And guess what happens under Victoria? Britain becomes an empire on which the sun never sets. Why? Because it's riding high on the technology of its time. And Paraguay and Colombia and Bolivia and China and countries all over the world are buying steam engines from England. They are buying cotton from England, even in India, where everybody lives next to a guy who hand looms cotton. Nobody buys from the guy next door anymore. Why? Because the British cotton that's come in, that's been made by a machine, with cotton that's been raised on a plantation, is cheaper than the homegrown stuff back in India itself. And Britain is cleaning up. And Britain becomes the center of the world, and it develops a shipping industry and a banking industry like nothing the world has ever seen before. It is global, Ian. It is astonishing in its power. But guess what? By 1850, everybody who wants a steam engine's got one. Everybody who wants a steamboat has got one. Everybody who wants a cotton cap and a cotton shirt has one, besides which people are now using their own steam engines to make their own cotton in their own countries. And Britain begins to peak. But Britain doesn't realize it's peaking. It's keeping its military glory. It still rules the world. Britain has no idea that it's peaking until 1873. And in 1873, there comes a panic. Now remember, there's a difference between the little panics and the big panics. There's a difference between just the waves coming in and going out and the tidal waves. And nobody quite realizes at first. They think this is just another wave, but it's not a wave, Ian. It's a tidal wave. Why? Because the technology they're riding has peaked. Now, there are new technologies coming up on the horizon, and the irony is they're being developed in Britain. They've been invented in Britain. One of them is something that a couple of guys named Maxwell and Faraday have been fiddling around with in the lab based on magnetism, and they managed to get a bunch of electrons to flow in a wire, and they call it electricity. Well, they do all the research on the subject, but they don't bother to develop any of the new products based on electricity. So a couple of countries that are nobodies, everybody looks on them as, my God, what barbarians, decide to pick up on electricity. There's a kid named Thomas Alva Edison who doesn't even have a decent education and is half-deaf in one ear, and he goes nuts with this electrical stuff in the United States. And there's a family named Siemens, and they go nuts with the electrical generating equipment over in Germany. Then there's something else that the British have come up with. The British want to take over. They have this massive empire. They want to take over Africa. Everybody wants to take over Africa, but white people can't seem to take over Africa because if you try to get anywhere further than 10 miles from the shore, you drop dead. You're hit with malaria. You're hit with all kinds of crazy diseases. And there's a stuff made from a Peruvian bark that you can use to wipe out the symptoms of malaria. It's called Kinkona. But nobody seems to be able, as good as Britain is at monocropping, they can't figure out how to monocrop Kinkona. So somebody in a chemical lab, remember, chemistry is brand new stuff, in a chemical lab in Britain, this German who happens to be teaching chemistry says to one of his grad students, you know, there's this stuff that we make from coal tar. Now, coal tar is toxic waste. It's poisonous. It's disastrous, horrible, glumpy stuff. He says, why don't you try taking this toxic waste and seeing if you can use the techniques of chemistry to turn it into Kinkona, which we know as quinine. And this kid tries, and he doesn't manage to get quinine. But guess what he does get? He gets this lovely green-shaded liquid and discovers that if he dips some cotton, you know, this new stuff that is now readily available inexpensively, and he dips some cotton in it, it turns this great shade that nobody's ever seen before. So he decides to go into the dye business with this stuff. And on this business, this is the beginning of the chemical industry. Well, the guy who founds the dye business, his name is Perkin. You can still hear of Perkin dyes. Perkin, when he makes a fortune, then goes back to his true love, which is basic research, and abandons the dye industry. Nobody in Britain picks it up. Meanwhile, the Germans begin to think maybe there's something in this chemistry stuff. And they invite the professor who had told Perkin to make artificial Kinkona out of coal tar back to Germany. And guess what? They discovered that you can make from chemicals a new fertilizer. And with the new fertilizer, you can raise 4 times as much food on an acre of land. And of course, then the Germans develop all kinds of other chemicals. So the Germans and the Americans are on top of the 2 new industries that are bubbling under the surface, the 2 new technologies that are bubbling under the surface in 1873, and Britain is not. The Germans and the Americans are on top of the electrical industry, the chemical industry, and one other industry that was developed in Britain but not commercialized in Britain. And that's a new thing that replaces pig iron called steel. And the Germans are on top of that, and the Americans, the Krupp family in Germany is on top of that, and in America it's Andrew Carnegie who's on top of that.
Well, then is there a particular date in 1873, though, where this comes to a head for England, and they experienced the kind of crash that we are seeing here in the United States.
Yes. And I can't give you the exact date. It's probably September.
Okay, right.
But it is 1873, and one of the Englishmen watching this happen says, this is unlike any depression we've ever experienced in my life. This is unlike any, well, they didn't have the word recession, but he says there is a bleakness of hope and a loss of confidence and optimism that makes it look like this is the end of our civilization itself. And guess what? In a sense, he was right. It was, because America and Germany would continue to rise after that depression, and England would continue to stagnate. And its stagnant position would be reaffirmed by World War I. So even though England won World War I, technically it lost. It lost its empire. It lost its preeminent position at the head of the economic chain. But it had already lost it by 1873 because it had failed to develop the technologies of the future. And what's the lesson for America? Develop the technologies of the future.
Well, but part of the lesson, if I'm correct in assessing what you just said there, is the actual time that we realize that we have got ourselves out of sync with the next wave of economic success. By the time we realize that either our surfboard is pointed in the wrong direction, or
that's a wonderful image.
We just grabbed the wrong wave, and somebody else is going to ride the tidal wave that's coming. By the time we realize it actually has already happened about 20 years ago. I mean, the technology existed that other people glommed onto that we took for granted. If we're going to use the example from the British Empire, so what's that next technology that's coming, and how is it that we missed it?
There are two of them. Usually, new technologies involve opening vast new frontiers, but frontiers are not always literal. Frontiers are not always a new real estate. Sometimes they're real estate in your head. And right now we are opening those new frontiers like crazy. It's the virtual world. It's the cyber world. There are two products that are selling like crazy today, despite the fact that the economy all over the world is crashing at an incredible rate. And they are mini laptops, which were developed in Taiwan. We did not develop them. And the smartphone, the iPhone and its imitators, at the BlackBerry, for example. And those things are selling like crazy. And there's a description in one of the articles about how the BlackBerry is being used, about a woman who she's waiting in line at the grocery counter at the supermarket, and she's doing her email. She's waiting for a bus, and she's doing her email. She's sitting on the bus, and she's doing her email. All this time that was formerly barren and empty is time that's opened up to her as if it were her own personal real estate, her own personal frontier, her own personal virtual landscape. And that's one of the technologies that's going to carry us forward. The other one is going to be the next form of energy. And the next forms of energy are going to be things we know about and things we have to look really far ahead to. And the things we know about are ground solar, wind, geothermal. Those are the alternative energy sources. And then above our head, these things are all finite. And one of the members of my Space Development Steering Committee has done a 9-month study. He's just about finished with it, which demonstrates that if we use every conceivable form of energy we've got on Earth, including all the ones I just mentioned, plus clean coal, dirty coal, oil, shale oil, natural gas, we will have run out of energy by 2100 because all these sources are finite. Is there an infinite energy source anywhere near this planet that we know of? Yes, it's above our head. It's solar power harvested in space.
All right, hang on. Harvesting in space solar power as that next technology, then, that would make us competitive with ourselves. But hang on then. We'll come back. Howard Bloom and more lessons from history as we reinvent capitalism, as it were. The rise of the cup and saucer next on Coast to Coast AM.